Hello, I've been for a wet walk with Daisy and I thought that I'd come in and do chapter 9 of Podkin. This chapter is called Shape and Quince. Podkin was dragged deeper and deeper into the bone root tunnels, the stinking rabbit's hand tight around his arm, his knife jabbing into his ribs. He could hear Paz following behind and Pook quietly crying. Every now and then the rabbit looked over his shoulder and made a comment. "That's it, little girl, you just keep following nicely and I won't have to slice up your brother." The further they got from the marketplace, the quieter it was. The noise of the market was still there, but muffled and distant, as if the whole thing had been a dream. At first there had been some signs of life and light, shop fronts and houses along the tunnel sides, a pickled radish vendor, a line of washing hummock to dry, a tavern. But now there was just the odd, empty burrow mouth, dark, lonely voids in the tunnel, which were already being slowly choked and filled up with spidery roots. Podkin wondered, in between sharp prickles of the knife in his side, whether the whole world would one day look like that, once rabbit kind had crumbled into dust. The roots, moss and earth would slowly crawl over everything, hiding away like it never existed at all. Every so often they came across a piece of rib or a jawbone jutting down from the roof or sticking up out of the floor. People had propped candles on top of some, and they were now decorated with stalactites of dribbled wax. Who did they once belong to? Who buried them? If it wasn't in fear for his life, Podkin might have stopped to ponder it all. It was damp here, mildewy and rotten. There were piles of mouldering rubbish all over the floor, adding to the stink of the decay. Mushrooms grew out the tunnel sides, glowing pale in the murk, like strange little ghosts or the eyes of lurking monsters. Every now and then something wriggled on the floor, fat, pale earthworms or grubs of some kind. Podkin heard Paz step on one. There was a soft pop, followed by a muffled squeal. She always had hated creepy crawlies. That's what made it so much fun to hide them in her bed, back in Mumbury. Oh, if only they were back in Mumbury. Podkin thought about trying to draw the dagger and fight the big rabbit off, but it was too tricky to get to. By the time he had untangled it from its cloth scabbard, the smelly oaf would probably have chopped him into pieces. Then the rabbit would have Starclaw as well. There was absolutely nothing Podkin can do. Finally, they came to a burrow entrance out at the furthest reaches of the tunnel. There were mounds of rotting scraps piled outside, half-chewed radishes, shards of broken pottery, sticky pools of mush that might once have been food. The tire floor of the tunnel was heaving and pulsing with maggots. A dim glow seeped out of the doorway. Podkin had a few seconds to wonder what terrors might lie within, and then the smelly rabbit pulled back the tattered blanket that covered the entrance and shoved him through. Paz and Pook were pushed after, crashing into his back and knocking them both on the floor. "Well, well, what have you caught, Quince?" Podkin looked up to find himself in a small burrow, a typical living area of most warren rabbits, but one that seemed tiny to him. The walls were bare earth, a patch of old whitewash here and there, but more patches of black mould and bubbling fungus. There was a large wooden chest by one wall and 2 cages made of crudely lashed together hazel branches against the other. The rest of the floor space was covered with piles of empty and broken clay bottles, gnawed carrot tops and layers of dust and cobwebs. This was a neglected and half-derelict place. It smelt stale and putrid, almost as bad as the tunnel outside. A small fireplace was hidden amongst the junk, and a few spluttering smoky logs were burning there, giving the place a hazy orange glow. Sitting beside it, warming his belly, was another rabbit, a huge, fat, his ears held back by a stained bandana. He had long braided beard with a silver bell tied at the end and was watching them with small eyes. By his side was a huge wooden club, studded at one end with rusty spikes and nails. "I have hit the jackpot, Mr. Shape," said the smelly rabbit, Quince. "2 posh little bunnies and 1 little sprogling. Found them peering at the saleswood like they were at the zoo or something." "Saleswood, eh? What if they wanted to see the best fighter in Bone Root? They only had to come here for a peek." The fat rabbit stood up, his stomach rolling off his lap to hang about his knees. He wore shoulder pads and leather greaves, but his great scarred belly was bare and as broad as an oak trunk. "Get them up so I can look at them." Podkin felt his good ear being pulled, bringing him to his feet. Paz was yanked up too, squealing in pain. Pook whined and tried to hide in his big sister's tunic. "Hearns Whiskers, look at that belt buckle and that bracelet. They look awfully heavy for such little kittens. Perhaps you should lighten their load, Quince." The smelly rabbit laughed and roughly pulled off Paz's bracelet. He grabbed Podkin's belt and sawed the leather with his knife. Podkin wanted to shout about how it had been a midwinter present from his father, but the look on Mr. Sharp's face made him keep his mouth shut. "They got anything else, Quince?" Podkin felt the Weasley rabbit's hand close over Starclaw's scabbard and the knife was yanked free. He closed his eyes in despair. The one thing you were told to keep safe, and you couldn't even do this. "Just this crummy old butter knife, Mr. Shape. Doesn't look fit to trim my toenails with." Shape gave it a glance, but he was more interested in the buckle and the bracelet that Quince had just tossed at him. "Well, consider that your first night's rent paid," said Shape. "You can keep that toy knife for now. You couldn't do any harm with it anyway, and it might come in handy for cutting purses. After all, you'll be earning your room and board in future." Both the nasty rabbits laughed hard at this joke, although Podkin had no idea what it meant. "Show them their room, Quince." The smelly rabbit went over to the wooden cages. He pulled the door open to one, and the 3 little rabbits were kicked inside. "Just in case you were thinking of sneaking out in the night," said Mr. Shape, "you should know one of us is always awake, watching you very, very closely." Quince cackled and waved his knife in the candlelight so it sparkled, leaving the rabbits in no doubt as to what would happen to them if they tried to escape. As the evil rabbits laughed some more, Podkin and Paz looked at each other, wide-eyed and terrified. The rest of that night felt endless, uncomfortable and frightening. Podkin and Paz sat in their little cage, staring out of the burrow where Quince and Shape sat, while Poot snuggled between them, whining for food. Once or twice they tried to whisper to each other, but the 2 villains always heard them. Quince had a long stick he used to poke and prod them through the bars, trying his best to crack them on the heads or shins where it really hurt. In the end, they gave up trying to speak and just sat there in miserable silence. Podkin noticed the huddled shape of 2 other rabbits in the second cage. Small ones, children like him probably. They had obviously learnt not to make any sounds. Once he thought he had glimpsed an eye peeking at him before blinking shut again. He wondered how long they'd been there, trapped without anyone to rescue them. The thought made him shudder. After Goddess knows how long, Pook whimpered himself to sleep. Paz too seemed to have drifted off, and the snores started to come from the 2 big rabbits, guarding them on the other side of the bars. "This is my chance," Podkin thought, "but what can I do?" Podkin's scared little mind whirred, trying to think of a plan, but came up with nothing. What would Father have done? He tried to listen for the reassuring voice inside his head, but there was only silence. Would he have sat here and waited for what misery morning would bring? Never. By now he probably would have sliced through the bars and run charging at the villies, ready to chop the rabbit into rabbit hot pot. Well, that wasn't going to happen. He had missed every single one of his weapons lessons. He barely knew the handle of the sword from the pointy end, but maybe he could cut a small hole in the bars for them to sneak out. It sounded like a much better plan, with a lot less slicing. He thought he might be able to slide Starkle out from under his cloak and chop through the cage bars, and just was itching his hand across to do it when a voice from the shadows outside made him freeze. "I'm still awake, you little rat weasel," came Shape's deep rumbling tones, "and I'll be awake for the next 2 hours until it's Quince's turn to watch you. You'll not get away that easy." The fat rabbit chuckled to himself and settled back to sipping mead or whatever he was doing. Sure enough, ages later, he nudged Quince awake and lay down to sleep on the scrap of the blanket. Quince is smaller, Podkin thought. Maybe I could get out and lop off his head before he could wake up Shape, but he knew he wouldn't do it. Toppling a tree on someone is one thing. Chopping a rabbit's head off would be unbearable. Waiting till morning it is then. Podkin couldn't help but feel he failed some kind of test. But then he was well used to failing tests. In fact, he was probably an expert at it. "Sorry, Father. I'm just not a hero like you." He rubbed the bare spot where his belt buckle had been and dreamt memories of the Brandlemas day he had unwrapped it, with his proud father smiling on. Come morning, a bleary-eyed, exhausted Podkin sat in the corner of the cage. Paz and Pook had both had a pretty good night's sleep, all things considered, but Podkin had barely managed to catch a wink. Noises from outside the cage had stirred them, and the 3 rabbits gave each other nervous glances, wondering what horrible thing was going to happen next. Both Shape and Quince were up now. They opened the cage door and dragged Podkin out by his collar. The little rabbit stood in the dingy burrow, swaying on his feet, while they pulled another rabbit out of the second cage. It was a tiny brown rabbit with a fuzzy cotton ball of a face and pointy little ears. Another, just like it, peered sadly through the cage bars. "Listen up, new boy," said Mr. Shape, bending down over his fat belly to peer in Podkin's face. "You're going to go back to the market to spend the rest of this lovely day begging, scrounging and stealing everything you can to get your little paws on." "Food we want," said Quince, "and drink and money and anything else we can sell to make money." "Basically," Shape continued, "we want you to fill your pockets with as much stuff as you can and then bring it back here to us." "And if I don't?" Podkin asked. He didn't like the sound of stealing, much less coming back to his stinking ferret hole of a burrow. "Why, if you don't, then we might get hungry and decide to eat your big sister," said Quince. "A nice little snack she'd make, eh, Quincy?" said Shape, his broad belly rippling with laughter. Podkin gulped. Shape, suddenly serious again, grabbed him by the collar and pulled him close. "She's our insurance," he growled in Podkin's face. "Keeping her safe is what makes you come back here every day. Every day." "Oh, yes," Shape gave an evil grin. "You work for us now, and you're going to be working for us for a very long time." In the cage, Pook started crying and crying and crying. It got louder and louder until it became a piercing wail. Paz tried to quiet him, afraid of Quince's jabbing stick, but he wouldn't shush. Not even when Paz mentioned soup. She looked out at Podkin, scared. "Shut that brat up," Shape yelled, "or by Hearn's hairy kneecaps I'll do it for you." Quince made to grab his stick, so Podkin quickly spoke. "He won't be quiet. Not as long as he's in a cage," he said. "I'll have to take him with me. You won't hear him then, and you've still got my sister to make sure I can come back." He wasn't sure what he was going to do with Pook exactly. He just knew that he had to get him away from Quince and Shape. Perhaps the pair of them could escape somehow, come back with help for Paz. But there was nobody who would help them now that they had no money to bargain with. "Take him then," Shape shouted. "Just stop that flaming screeching." Quince opened the cage door and pulled Pook out of Paz's arms. then swung him at Podkin. Podkin just managed to catch his little brother, and at least the shock had stopped him crying for a moment. "Right, enough of this chin wagging," said Shape. "Get out there and get us some loot." With several nudges from his bony foot, Quince shoved Podkin and the other rabbit out of the burrow into the tunnel, then pulled the blankets shut. Podkin managed to catch Paz's eyes for a moment as he left. She looked lonely, sad and frightened, but she had had enough time to motion him. A small, flickering movement with her fingers. "Run," she meant. "Go, leave." She was telling him to take Pook and not come back. Chapter 10 next. Fox Paw. What's going to happen to them all? See you soon. Bye.